All right, in this video, we're going to go over the muddy points for the social psychology section. Let's take a look here. So a couple of things came up. It was actually a few people mentioned the pro-social behaviors section in the book. And I just wouldn't stress on that because that's not something that's included in our study guide. So it's not something that's going to come up on the exam. So if you do have some questions you want to chat about that, absolutely let me know. But as far as for the muddy points review, no real need for me to go over those. One person mentioned that just how subjective the topic is. I feel like it varies from person to person. It's hard to get concrete evidence on a topic like this. Other than that, there wasn't much that I struggled with in this topic. I think that's one. It's a great point, and it's worth pointing out that the way a lot of experimental psychology works is we're looking at group averages. So we're looking not at what do individuals do and noticing all the differences. Instead, we're comparing groups of people, and so the results are based on an average. So that means that that average fits many people in that group, but there are going to be some people in that group that the average doesn't fit. And so I think that's the case, for most research studies, is that we're looking at large numbers and we're looking at the averages as a whole. So it's not going to fit everybody, but the way we run our studies and the way we run statistics is it should fit most people. So it will vary from person to person, as this individual points out. But I do think that it's somewhat generalizable. Again, if that study has gone through the statistical analyses and a study has been replicated a number of times, you can be pretty confident that it's going to apply to most people. Not everybody, and I think that's always important to point out. But what I would also just caution with social psychology is a lot of times, and a lot of the stuff that I've chosen to present in social psychology are findings that are sometimes surprising to people, and many people would argue they would never do that. So for example, the Milgram study. So most people say, would swear up and down that they would never shock somebody in another room until they, apparently die. But again, Milgram study found that over 60% of the participants did that. So then a lot of people say, okay, well, that study was done mostly with males. It was done back in the 50s. It probably doesn't apply today. We're much more individualistic today and so on. And I think those are all great arguments. The only thing is that the study has been replicated and reasonably recently, and the same results happen. So it seems to be more about human nature than just, the time period. And also, I would even just argue some of the stuff that's going on today as far as with coronavirus, people's belief systems. People are much more motivated. It's what we call motivated reasoning. They are more motivated to believe certain things against evidence. And part of that's because of conformity. And some of that can be based on group memberships. So if you really identify with a certain political party, it can be very hard to accept facts that kind of dispute what your party believes. Because if those facts are true and then your party is wrong then on those facts, then that maybe makes your party not seem so good, and then that calls you into question because that's who you think. You think of yourself as a party member, and thus then that would directly reflect on you, and so people are motivated to not change that. And so I think that a lot of times these findings can apply to a lot of us, and it's sort of the ugly side of human nature. People really wanted to believe that Germans during World War II, there was something just wrong with Germans. But most of the research comes back and something's wrong with humans. And we're all susceptible, and that's why it's so important to accept a lot of these findings they aren't necessarily going to apply to you 100%, but I think it's important to accept them in because it can help us then catch our biases, because we all have them. And so I think it's more important to recognize that, acknowledge that, and then try to fight against them, our own biases. And not enough people, fight against their own biases. They're always we all seem to prefer to point out everyone else's biases. So that's one of the things I like about psychology, is it can be really applied to ourselves. And so I think it's good when we do that. I'm curious about how social media will reflect our concept of persuasion. My childhood was not influenced by the internet or social media. It'd be interesting to see how long-term effects of social media are on our children growing up. I think that's a great point. There's a lot of, again, I think a lot of it is, there's often a lot of focus on the negative side of it. There's probably some positive side. I think a lot of it is the potential for motivated reasoning again. So if you have a belief, it is not hard at all to find people who absolutely agree with you and make, what feel like really good points. And again, you won't challenge, any slight problems with their statements, because you want to believe them. And then you can also run into people who have the opposite of your view, and you'll attack their points as, find all the flaws in their thinking. But I think social media just makes it that much easier for us to reinforce our own beliefs. And so I do think that'll be interesting to see how that goes, because it's right now, with the way social media is working, it is a completely free-flowing, 99.9% free-flowing ideas. And so there's a lot of bat poop crazy ideas out there that are getting equal screen time as others. And so I think, we all have to learn new ways to find information, because, we used to be able to trust books and things because there was a person vetting the information, meaning the publisher is going to decide, is this book worth publishing? Now there's nobody. Anyone can post anything, saying whatever they want. There's no filter that's going on. And so it's now more on us to approach that information very critically. And we really just have to start with assume it's wrong, especially if it just fits really well with your belief system. Really good idea to just immediately, if it sounds too good to be true, probably is. We could all probably use that kind of approach more on with our own. We really need to challenge our own beliefs. Muddy's thing for me for this topic is cognitive dissonance. I think that one, it's my favorite theory. So just to explain it again, dissonance is an uncomfortable feeling. Think of it as synonymous with anxiety. All right. So if you experience cognitive dissonance, it's an anxiety about some thoughts that are going on. And usually what it is you have a certain belief, and then you run into information that contradicts what you believe. So this is, again, just what we've been talking about, reasoning or motivated reasoning. Okay, I believe this. I want to keep believing this. The simplest thing to do is to keep believing what I believe. The laziest thing to do is just continue to believe what I believe. Changing our minds is hard. It's hard work. So I run into information that contradicts that. I feel uncomfortable. I feel this cognitive dissonance. At that point, that dissonance is so uncomfortable that you are motivated to get rid of it. The issue then is, how are you going to get rid of it? All cognitive dissonance basically states is that you're going to feel the dissonance and you're going to want to get rid of it. But there are different ways you can get rid of it, and that's where, it can be really fascinating. And so one way to get rid of dissonance, if you run into new information that contradicts your belief, is to change your belief, to adapt to it. So think about kids. When young toddlers, we teach them what a dog is, and then they're pointing out dogs and like, doggy, and you're like, yeah, doggy, yeah. And then they point at a cat and say, doggy, and you say, no. That's contradictory information. They're going to experience cognitive dissonance. They want to get rid of it. Ideally, that child creates a new schema of cats. And now that is a cat. All right, so that's a very successful use of cognitive dissonance. But just know that you can get rid of cognitive dissonance otherwise. And often those are not, it sort of depends, but they're often not useful. The most common one that you see in political talk is attacking the messenger. So if somebody states something that goes against your belief, they make a very good argument against a belief that you have, well, then you will attack their person. And you'll say, oh, well, sure, that's what the guy who has, has so much money that they think that they're all entitled and everything. So why should we listen to them? Or that's the person who wears these kind of clothes and, they're crazy. Or that's the person, and we attack them with the goal is to make them look less knowledgeable, less respectable, whatever it is, so that then that information that they brought in that contradicts what we believe, maybe we'll just be like, yeah, we don't need to listen to it. Okay, so there's all sorts of strategies for that. So it's a really interesting thing. So if you want to try to help somebody change their mind on something, ideally what you got to create is a little bit of dissonance. You've got to bring information that contradicts what they think, and just bring that, get them to face that, and then hopefully help them not take the easy ways out of blaming you for bringing the information to them or coming up with other rationalizations, is simply just to face the information and then adapt their belief. Next one. One question I had was about stereotype threat. I thought being told you can't do something would motivate you to perform even better when you're not told this. Is stereotype threat a contributing factor to test anxiety, which causes underperformance, or is that a separate issue? It's a great question. I think they're probably somewhat related. I think you could potentially argue that sometimes stereotype threat happens, or when stereotype threat happens, it is essentially causing a test anxiety. Because we said, like on an IQ test, if somebody is a part of a group that's we stereotype as not being smart, they're afraid of confirming that, and they get that extra anxiety, and thus they underperform. That is kind of like test anxiety. It's a little bit more than test anxiety, but it's very related. So I think that's there is something connected there. But I would definitely also try to keep them somewhat separated. So stereotype threat could result in test anxiety, and I think that's one of the points that this student's trying to make. And I think that is part of it, that part of the impact of stereotype threat is coming from some version of test anxiety. But then there's other things of just, just some underperformance, of over focusing on it, not being able to get in the zone and things like that, which might also be playing a role. And I think the question is that I thought people, being told you couldn't do something would motivate you. Depends on the person, but there's a lot of people where it doesn't seem to motivate them. And what's interesting, and I think we pointed it out, is that one of the things that undermines stereotype threat is a thing called growth mindset. Because having a growth mindset, stereotypes don't really make sense. And so it might be that people with fixed mindset are the ones that are a little bit more likely to get kind of caught up in a stereotype threat. Those with a growth mindset are maybe the ones that are more likely to be motivated to perform better, that they're going to try that much harder. So again, there's often these multiple factors going on. In the Robbers Cave experiment, put two groups together. Did the prejudicial attitudes decrease because they changed the definition of the in-group and the out-group? Maybe prejudice remained, but they found common ground amongst one another. Okay, so we didn't really focus on this one a whole lot. But the Robbers Cave, they had these two groups. They're in camp, so like summer camp, and they're like teenagers and preteens, but they're like kept separate for a while. So they create all this sort of bonding with each other, and then they start interacting with each other. But when they first start to interact, they're competing. So they start to act very prejudicial towards people in the other group. Even though they were all boys, they were all pretty much white, they were all very similar in so many ways, they found ways to think of how they were different, because one was the blue group and one was the red group or whatever. And so they just come up with all these slurs for the other group. They come up with all these things about our own group that's so good. So you can definitely see the in-group, out-group forming, and it's being reinforced by prejudicial and stereotyping, prejudicial behavior and stereotyping. So then when they had them start doing tasks that forced them to cooperate more, they started to have less prejudicial or obvious prejudicial sort of behaviors. So I'm not sure exactly if this is what the student means, but maybe the prejudice remained, but they found common ground. So for this group, they start to see the other people not as, just bad and the other group, the out group, but they see the connection, they see the similarities. That's that finding common ground amongst one another. And that starts to undermine this idea that they are other and thus bad. So now they're starting to see they're more like we're all kind of similar. And yeah, they're part of that camp, but, and so there's definitely a lot of research that shows that just getting people to interact with people in a different group, in an out group, drastically reduces the prejudice towards that out group. So this person say maybe the prejudice remained. I would say what happens is prejudice is a natural human brain strategy. So I tend to think of prejudging, which is what prejudice is, as just a brain shortcut. It is sometimes very wrong. Inaccurate and also morally wrong. But it is simply our brain trying to come up with answers in a very short amount of time. And so we're never going to get rid of it. We're always going to be, have a tendency, our brain is going to sometimes prejudge things because it's just trying to quickly get the answer. But the strength of that prejudice, the meaning of that prejudice, or the trust in those prejudices can be completely undermined by, again, connecting with people in the other group, seeing the commonalities, also being able to recognize that difference isn't bad. We don't have to be all the same. We can be different. And so it's more of a honoring or appreciating difference and not having to be similar. But we as a species also tend to react to difference as a negative. And last one, does de-individuation change as people get older? The trick-or-treat experiment was done on children, so is this behavior instinctual to us? Great question. Again, I love how you guys are pointing out other variables that are going on. So yeah, it was done on children. It's important to maybe be careful generalizing that result to adults. Although I do think that you see a lot of the same behavior in adults. We love a scapegoat. We are very comfortable doing bad behaviors when we're in groups. Yeah, there's watch Twitter and videos of people hitting each other. They're either in groups or I'm thinking of the guy at the Suns game who many of you might be, fans of because he punched a Lakers fan? I can't remember now. But he punched an opposing team's fan in the face. And, would he have done that if he was out on the street by himself or he was at an opposing team's game, like he was in LA for the game? No, maybe not. He felt more comfortable doing that because he's with other Suns fans. So, some of this stuff is that, he's probably feeling a little less responsible because there's, again, other Suns fans around. So I do think that it probably does change, but it also probably doesn't go away. It just might come out in a different way. So that's it for social psychology.